I was still holding the plastic garment bag in my hand when the applause erupted. She walked onto the stage in the dress I had ironed that morning, the one I stayed up until 2 a.m. stitching the hem of because she'd asked me if I could fix it real quick. I remember thinking how elegant she looked in it. Regal almost. She always had that presence when the spotlight found her. But what I hadn't expected, what I still hear echoing in my chest, was how she scanned the crowd when they handed her the award, smiled at the front row, and then said, "I want to thank the people who really believed in me," and never once looked in my direction. I was standing in the wings, the same place I'd stood for years, the place where you can clap but never be clapped for. I don't remember if I smiled. I think my face just froze, not out of shock, but out of recognition, because this wasn't the first time she'd rewritten the story with herself as the solo author. It was just the first time she did it on a microphone. When she walked off stage, award in hand, I held the bag open to protect the dress. She walked past me, breathless with adrenaline, and didn't even glance back. No, did I do okay? No, did you see me? Just a swish of fabric and perfume, and applause still ringing from a crowd that didn't know I was even there. That night, I carried her dress home like it belonged to someone else. And maybe, deep down, I already knew I was done sewing myself into someone else's success story. It wasn't the first time I'd played the invisible role. I'd been behind the curtain in a dozen versions of her life. The mock interviews, in our kitchen, the late-night practice runs where I applauded alone, the resume tweaks she never acknowledged but used anyway. I was always the you-know-who in her stories. The friend who drove, the one who helped a little, never the name. Never the face. That day, while she stood on stage in something I'd hand-delivered, I realized I had stopped existing as a person in her life and become a function. Someone to press seams, hold keys, snap photos, remind her when to breathe, and the worst part, I thought I was okay with it. For years, I told myself, she's just overwhelmed, or she means well, deep down, but there's something sobering about standing 10 feet away from someone who knows exactly what you've done for them and watching them pretend you don't exist. Not because they forgot, but because it's cleaner that way. Easier to present success as self-made, unassisted. There's no applause for the one who bought the shoes or filled the gas tank or held her hand when she said she couldn't do it. I stood backstage, surrounded by strangers clapping for her, and realized they'd never hear my name, not once. And if they did, it would be a footnote, an anecdote. The helper? I wasn't angry, not yet, just hollow, like I'd been emptied out to make room for her light. And the more she shone, the more I disappeared, quietly, dutifully, without making a scene after the ceremony. Everyone spilled into the hallway with cameras and champagne flutes, buzzing around her like she was royalty. I watched her pose. Beside the event banner, one hand on her hip, the other holding the award as if it had always belonged to her. Her laughter was loud, magnetic. They handed her roses and asked what inspired her speech, and she said, "Just years of believing in myself." That line clung to me like static, believing in herself. I remembered the night she nearly dropped out, sobbing into my shoulder, saying, "What if I'm not enough?" I had held her through those moments, the breakdowns no one saw, the doubt she now edits out of her origin story. But that night I said nothing. I didn't correct her. I didn't wave my hand and say, "Hey, I was there too," because I knew it wouldn't change how she told the story. It would just make me look bitter. So I stayed by the coat rack, holding her sweater, watching as she took selfies with people who didn't even know her middle name. I left early, unnoticed, walking 3 blocks to the train station because I hadn't budgeted for parking. The garment bag was heavier than it should have been. Maybe because it carried more than just fabric. It carried the silence, the gratitude unspoken, the weight of being erased while smiling. When I got home, I hung the dress on the door and stared at it for a long time. It shimmered in the low light, beautiful and untouched, a perfect symbol of what I had always been to her. Essential, invisible, and never quite worth a second glance. I woke up the next morning with a familiar ache, not physical, but the kind that settles deep when your worth has been measured in silence. The dress was still hanging there like a ghost of the night before. I thought about folding it and returning it to her, maybe slipping it back into her closet like I had so many times before, but something in me hesitated, not out of spite, but preservation. I needed distance, not the kind you announce, but the kind you honor quietly, like a wound that can't be touched just yet. I spent the day in stillness. No music, no distractions, just me and the echo of applause that had never been meant for me. I found myself replaying moments, not just the night before, but all the ones that came before it. The forgotten thank yous, the missed acknowledgments, the way I always stayed behind the lens while she stood front and center. I remembered the time I helped her write the email that got her the internship, or when I drove 2 hours just to bring her the heels she left behind. None of that made it into her speeches. And maybe that's what stung most. Not that she forgot, but that she remembered and chose not to name it. There's a difference. Forgetting is human. Erasure is strategic. It preserves the myth that she rose alone, against all odds, untouched by help or handouts. But I was there. I had always been there. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself admit I deserved more than proximity. I deserved presence. Not just to be beside her, but to be seen beside her. Later that week, a friend of hers, someone I barely knew, tagged her in a post, so proud of this queen, self-made and unstoppable. And there she was again, radiant in the same dress I had carried, pressed, and handed over, now captured in filtered glory. The caption stabbed more than it should have. Self-made, the internet loves that term. It sounds romantic, resilient, but no one's asking who booked the train tickets, who held the phone light during late-night rehearsals, who made space, over and over, so she could expand. I wasn't angry at the people who didn't know. They were clapping for the version of her that she carefully curated, polished, independent, untouched by struggle. I was angry at myself for letting my efforts become invisible by design. I had fed the myth. Every time I said it's fine or don't worry about it, I handed her another clean page to write me out of. I was the ghost editor in her biography, erasing my fingerprints from the margins. That post got hundreds of likes, and she reshared it with a heart emoji. I waited to see if she'd message me, even just to thank you again. Nothing. No mention of the bag I returned to her building's front desk, or the tiny pin I fixed on the back of the dress when she wasn't looking. It was a small thing, one she might not have noticed, but I had. That was the pattern. She wore things. Without knowing who mended them, she spoke boldly without remembering who first helped her find her voice, and I had stopped reminding her, hoping she'd remember on her own. But maybe forgetting was part of the costume too. That weekend, I sat at the edge of my bed, scrolling through photos of the event, each one framed just right, all spotlight and sparkle. None of them showed the side door I waited near, or the garment bag I clutched to keep the fabric safe. And yet I recognized every angle, every smile. I'd seen them before countless times in dressing rooms and backstage mirrors. I knew which compliments she practiced. I knew which tilt of her chin made her look most confident. I had helped build this version of her piece by piece, but in every image she looked like a woman untouched by scaffolding. Like she had climbed here with no one holding the ladder. I zoomed in on one picture, the one where she held the award with both hands, eyes closed in what looked like reverence. It was beautiful, really, but I couldn't stop my chest from tightening because I knew what came before that shot. The panic over a missed button, the trembling in her voice, the way she had squeezed my hand before walking on stage and said, "Stay close." Okay. And then never turned back. I saved the image not because I wanted to remember it, but because I needed to see it. To finally acknowledge the gap between who she was with me and who she became without me. And somewhere in that quiet room, I whispered aloud, maybe the first time she needed me, but only in private. On the stage, in the stories, in the polished version of her life, I was always meant to vanish. To be useful, not visible. And I was done rehearsing a part I was never going to be credited for. The next time I saw her was at a gallery opening. She didn't know I'd be there. I was invited by a mutual friend who had no idea of the distance growing between us. When she walked in, draped in another designer dress, surrounded by people who spoke too loudly and cared too little, our eyes met for a second. Just long enough for recognition, not long enough for obligation. She gave me a polite smile. One of those reflexes you give to someone you once knew but can no longer place. I smiled back, but mine held weight. The kind you earn after carrying someone else's success without ever being thanked. She looked stunning, as always. Magnetic in a way that made people lean toward her without realizing why. I watched her move from group to group, each time shifting her tone, her laughter, her posture, like a mirror to whoever stood in front of her. And I realized I used to be one of those people, reflecting her shine, believing it made me glow, too. But that night I stayed rooted in a quiet corner, sipping cheap wine and wearing the earrings I had once lent her for another event she forgot to thank me for. I felt no urge to approach her, no sting, just a strange kind of peace. Like walking past a house you used to live in, familiar, but no longer yours. A man beside me commented on her presence. "She's unforgettable, huh?" I smiled again, softer this time. "Some people are," I said. But what I didn't add, what I kept to myself, was that unforgettable doesn't always mean irreplaceable. Sometimes it just means you finally remembered yourself after being forgotten for too long. As the evening stretched on, I wandered into a side room where smaller pieces hung in quieter corners, art that didn't demand attention but rewarded it. There was a sketch tucked near the exit, done in charcoal and ink. It showed a woman threading a needle, her face soft with focus, her hands worn but steady. Something about it stopped me. Not because it looked like me, it didn't, but because it felt like me. The caption read, "The ones who mend." I stood in front of it for a long time, not moving, barely blinking. I thought about all the times I'd sewn things back together, not just dresses, but her nerves, her confidence, her broken time. I thought about how many people like me are hidden in the seams of someone else's story. Quiet fixers, emotional tailors, never on the program but always on call. I reached out and lightly touched the glass frame for the first time in months. I felt something warm stir in my chest, not anger, not regret, but clarity. I had spent so long waiting for someone to say, "I couldn't have done it without you," when what I really needed was to say, "I don't need to be needed to matter." That sketch, in its small, quiet glory, reminded me that even the unseen hands leave marks. That absence, when chosen, is its own kind of power. And as I turned away from the drawing, I felt a strange lift, not like flight, but like release. I wasn't healed, but I wasn't bound anymore either. I was becoming mine again before I left the gallery. I passed her once more near the coat check. She was laughing, loud, theatrical, a little too perfectly timed. The group around her was full of admiration, hanging on every word. I watched for a second, quietly observing the woman I used to orbit. She glanced at me briefly, that same polite curve of the lips, and I nodded but didn't stop. I didn't owe her presence anymore. That was the thing about rediscovering your own name. You stop answering to the ones others gave you. Outside, the air was crisp. I walked slower than usual, not because I was tired, but because I finally had nowhere to rush to. I stopped at a street vendor and bought myself a small ring, simple, silver, nothing flashy. I slid it on my finger and whispered, half to myself, "This one's just for me." A promise, not to erase what I'd given, but to stop offering pieces of myself to people who only wanted the shine, never the source. Back home, I opened my closet and saw the dress still hanging in the corner. I hadn't returned it. I hadn't donated it either. It just sat there, a quiet monument to all I had once accepted. I took it down, folded it gently, and placed it in a box, not out of bitterness, but completion. The chapter was closed. I didn't need to keep rereading it to know how it ended. That night, for the first time in a long while, I slept deeply. No rehearsals, no background roles. Just me. In the quiet of my own space, funnily enough without applause. A few weeks later, I got a message from her. Short, casual. "Hey, haven't seen you in a while. Hope you're good." There was no mention of the event, no acknowledgement of the silence that had passed like a continent between us. Just a sentence that skimmed the surface, hoping I'd fill in the rest. In the past, I might have rushed to reply. I would have over-explained, softened my tone, maybe even apologized for pulling away, as if creating distance from dismissal was somehow impolite. But this time, I didn't reply. Not out of malice, but out of clarity. I had finally understood the difference between being missed and being needed again. She wasn't reaching out because she saw me. She was reaching because something in her orbit had shifted, and I used to be the one who steadied it. That morning, I made tea and sat by the window, letting the message sit unread. It was strange how freeing that felt, to not scramble for approval, to not ache for acknowledgement. I was beginning to feel like a person again. Whole, not in relation to someone else's spotlight, but in the quiet corners of my own life. I had picked up small routines, watering my plants, writing again, saying no without guilt. Each day felt like a thread I was weaving back into my own fabric. It wasn't glamorous, and no one was clapping, but it was mine. And that I was. Learning was the beginning of something far more honest than recognition. It was restoration. Days passed. Then a week. Eventually she messaged again. This time it was longer. "Hey, I was wondering if you could help me with something for this upcoming panel. I know you're really good with that kind of stuff." I read it 3 times, not because I was surprised, but because the rhythm was so familiar. A soft opening followed by the ask, wrapped in flattery, just enough to sound like connection, but never quite reaching accountability. It was the same script she'd used for years, and I had always played my part, the helper, the fixer, the ghostwriter behind her polished delivery. But this time, something inside me stayed still. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel tempted. I felt done. I had spent so long being her safety net that I'd forgotten how to stand without bending. I put down the phone and looked around my apartment. Small, quiet, imperfect. The books on the shelf were ones I had chosen. The plants leaned toward the same light I did. Nothing here sparkled, but everything felt real. I opened my laptop and started writing. Not for her, but for me. A story, maybe? Or a letter I'd never send. I don't remember the words, only the feeling. like I was finally narrating from the center, not the wings. That day, I didn't answer her message. I didn't offer my skills or my presence or my shoulder. I offered myself something better. Silence. The kind that doesn't hide or punish but protects. The kind that builds a boundary so soft it feels like peace. The panel happened a few days later. I didn't watch it live, but a clip surfaced online. She was seated on stage in another elegant outfit, speaking confidently, answering questions, with charm. At one point, someone asked her about her journey, who had supported her along the way. She smiled, tilted her head, and said, "You know, I've always relied on myself. It's been lonely sometimes, but I think that's what made me strong." I didn't flinch. Not like before. I just closed the tab. Her words no longer pierced. They patterned. Predictable, rehearsed, curated for applause. But as the video ended, I noticed something different. I wasn't angry. I wasn't waiting. I wasn't hoping she'd change or remember or rewrite the line to include me. I had stopped auditioning for a role I never agreed to play. Later that night, I went through old photos, ones of me. This time, moments I'd forgotten. Laughing on a hike, baking alone, sketching by the window. They weren't glamorous, but they were full of presence, mine. Not beside anyone, not supporting, just existing. I printed one and pinned it to my corkboard. A small reminder, I am the main character here, and I don't need someone else's spotlight to be seen. That photo didn't need a caption. It didn't need applause. It just needed to be mine. When I turned off the light, I felt something. Inside, settle, a softness, a stillness. Like I had finally come home, not to a place, but to myself. It was spring when I finally gave the dress away. I folded it neatly, wrapped it in tissue paper, and brought it to a local donation center that specialized in formal wear for young women who couldn't afford their own. There was no ceremony to it, no speech or lingering look, just the quiet motion of release. The volunteer smiled and asked if I wanted a receipt. I shook my head. No proof necessary. That dress had lived its life with me. It had walked across a stage, held applause, and carried silence. It had seen me small, and now it would witness someone else rising. Maybe a girl who would twirl in it and feel radiant without owing that radiance to anyone. As I stepped back, outside, the sun warmed my face. The air smelled like beginnings, like lilac and pavement and possibility. I didn't feel hollow. I didn't feel wronged. I just felt spacious, like I had made room for something new. That night, I cooked myself a full dinner for the first time in a long while. Not leftovers, not whatever was easy, but a meal. That took time. I lit a candle, played music I liked, sat at the table alone but not lonely. I had thought for so long that recognition would heal me, that the sound of my name in someone else's mouth would be enough. But it wasn't. It never had been. Because healing doesn't come from being seen by someone else. It comes from finally seeing yourself fully, clearly, with all the quiet love you once reserved for others. And that night, I saw her. The woman I'd been all along, still standing, still worthy, still mine. A few days later, I walked past a boutique window and saw a dress that stopped me. Not because it was expensive or extravagant, it wasn't, but because it was nothing like what I'd worn before. Bright, bold, soft at the edges, the kind of dress you wear for yourself, not for an audience. I stepped inside, tried it, on, and for the first time in years, didn't look for anyone's approval in the mirror. No mental checklist of who might compliment it. No thoughts of how it might photograph. Just me, feeling the fabric, letting it move with my body. Not against it. I bought it without hesitation, no guilt, no discount needed. At home, I hung it where the other dress had once been. Same hook, new story. That simple swap felt like a reclamation. I wasn't trying to overwrite the past. I was choosing not to live there anymore. I wore it the next Sunday to the park. Sat under a tree with a book and an iced tea, and watched the world move without me needing to perform inside it. No one took my picture. No one asked who I was wearing, and I didn't need them to, because peace, I was learning, is the quiet presence of self without demand. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't unfinished. I wasn't waiting to be acknowledged. I was simply living, finally, gently, as someone who no longer needed to be essential to others to be enough for herself. Now, when I think of her, the daughter who once stood on stage in the dress I carried, who thanked everyone but me, I don't feel the sting anymore. I feel distance, like the kind that forms naturally between chapters. Not with resentment, but with respect for what no longer fits. She will keep building her life brick by brick on the scaffolding of applause. And I've found something quieter, but sturdier. A kind of dignity that doesn't crave a spotlight. I still love her, not for what she was or wasn't to me, but because loving her was never the mistake. Forgetting myself was, and that part, I've reclaimed. These days, when I tell my story, I don't start with who I supported or who I sacrificed for. I start with who I became when I stopped disappearing for other people's comfort. Because that woman, the one who quietly held everything together and then chose to let go, she deserves to be remembered, even if only by me, especially by me. So, if you've ever handed someone a piece of yourself only to be forgotten in the celebration, I see you. You were not invisible. You were not replaceable. You were the reason something beautiful stood tall. And maybe now it's your turn to be the one standing tall, quietly, without apology. Would you have done the same? Or would you have stayed in the background a little longer, just to be close?